Good morning, everyone. It sounds like you're having some great conversations about something you love that no one else maybe was super into. I love that. So hopefully you can continue some of these conversations after service. But like Andrew said, my name is Jordan. I'm one of the pastors here on staff, and it's just fun to be here on a Sunday morning, being able to celebrate what God is doing, and hopefully learn a bit this morning about what God is going to continue to do. And just going off the Super Bowl a little bit, one of my good friends is from Minnesota. He gave me a call this past week. He's like, Jordan, it's like everyone in LA just going crazy right now. Because he's like, if the Vikings were in Minnesota, like we'd all just be going nuts right now. I was like, no, honestly, no one really cares about it. He's like, well, who are you rooting for? And I was like, well, I feel like I have to root for the Rams because I live in LA, but I also wasn't a huge fan of that call that happened in the game, and so who knows what's going to happen. But anyway, all of a sudden, I didn't mean to bring up Conference. I'm sorry, I ruined this Sunday already. But in right? Yeah, you're there. Anyway, Rams house, right? So anyway, hopefully, like I said, hopefully you're able to share some of these things that are important to you and some of these things that you love. And as we jump into this morning, I'm excited to just continue this theme and this idea we've been talking about of this series we've been going through called Milk and Honey. And it's been this series we've been talking about as we're going into the New Year's. What does it look like to have routines in our life that point us to Jesus? And this idea of milk and honey that God promised the people as they were going to this promised land, that they were going to be full and in a land filled with milk and honey, and this land that was beautiful and perfect and sustaining. And we've been talking about what does it look like for us as a people here in LA and as a family here at Thrive to experience and to know who God is and where God is and to live into that. I got to be honest, coming in here this week, it was one of those weeks where it was just one of those weeks. And I think we can probably relate to that a little bit, some of us. And yeah, I came up here this morning and I thought, man, what am I doing standing up here? And there's these things of inadequacy, realizing, man, like we all have different gifts and different talents, and what is it like to have a room full of people with all these different gifts, and what is it like to bring the Word of God and to teach that, and yet realizing that all of us have a part in that, and all of us have a task, and all of us have a purpose in the kingdom of God, and all of us have a way that we can enter this promised land that God has given us. And man, I just felt so convicted of what is it like to empower and to encourage and to realize that this is a family here, that this is a body that gets to go out and gets to share the good news of Jesus. And oh, that's my heart this morning. That it wouldn't just be some person standing up here speaking, but that it would be all of us united in the cause of what God is doing. And so before we jump in this morning, I would love to just pray and ask God to be in this space and to be in this moment. And something I like to do is I put my hands up like this when I pray, just to be open and receptive to the things that God has. And I'd love to just challenge you guys this morning as we pray. Just put your hands out like this if you're comfortable with it. As this like posture of like receptivity to what God has for us in this space. Jesus, God, you are good, and we come to you this morning, God, and God, we come open-handed with our lives and with the things that we have, God, and we ask that you would just come, God, that we'd be open to you. God, that only the things of you would be remembered and the things of me would be forgotten, that it would be your words and not mine this morning, Jesus. God, the words of my mouth and the meditation of my heart would be acceptable unto you, God, and so we give you this morning, God, and we say thank you. In Jesus' name, amen. I want to ask us as we kind of jump in this morning, I want you to think back, when's the last time that someone asked you a question? Now, it was probably 30 seconds ago when Andrew just asked you a question. But beyond that, I want you to think, when's the last time that somebody asked you a question? Like, not just a generic question of, hey, where's the bathroom? Or, hey, how do I find directions to this place? But like a real question. Like a question about you, a question about something that you're interested in. When's the last time that someone came up to you and they just observed your life and they saw the things that you were doing and the things that you love, and they said, man, I know that person loves whatever that thing is that you love, and they just ask you a question about it? Andrew, he loves basketball, and I often find myself scrolling through ESPN and saying, man, I got to get all my Lakers statistics up because he loves the Lakers so that I can ask him good questions about it, because I know Andrew loves the Lakers. I know he loves basketball, and that's something that I ask him about because I know he's more of an expert than me at it, and we all have these different things in our life that we're experts at, things that we're passionate about, things that we know a lot about because we spend a lot of time doing. And when's the last time someone asked you a question about that thing that you love? What would it look like to be a person who lives such a life that demands people ask questions? To live such a life that people look at you and they can't wait to ask you something because they're just curious about the way that you live and the way that you interact and the way that you talk about things. what would it look like to be a person that had a life that was so curious and so interesting and so exciting that people took the time to just ask you questions about who you are? A little bit of recap. We've been going through Deuteronomy chapter 6 the last 3 weeks. We've been talking about the nation of Israel, God's chosen people, and how God led them out of slavery, and God promised them this new land. And as they're about ready to enter this new land, as we've been studying in Deuteronomy chapter 6, Moses, the guy who's leading the people, he gives kind of this final sermon, this final speech, this final pep talk, saying, hey, you guys are about to enter this land that God promised to give you. And it's been a long time coming, that you were in slavery, and it was hard, and you wondered when you would ever get out of there. And then finally God rescued you, and he brought you out, and you wandered through the wilderness, through the desert, through the land of nothing for 40 years. And finally you're at the brink, the cusp of entering into this land that God promised. And Moses says, don't forget these things. And he begins to give this final sermon, this final message to the people, encouraging them of what to do and where to go and how to live. And if you've been with us the last couple weeks, you know that we've been talking about that Moses told the people, if you want to succeed and you want to thrive in this land, you have to love the Lord your God with everything that you have. With every action, with every breath, and with every sentence, and with every thought that you have. And he says, love the Lord your God entirely and completely. And when you wake up in the morning, when you go to sleep at night, when you go to work, and when you're at home with your children, think about these things. And last week, Andrew talked about that. Part of that means that we build routines into our life, and that we have moments that we remember. And part of that's why we're sitting here on a Sunday, is not to just sit here and to listen, but to remember who God is and what God has done. And Andrew asked the question, do we have routines in our life that point us back to Jesus and who God is? And that when we enter the land, it's easy to forget. We have these moments of forgetfulness, and it's easy to forget God when we're where we think we're supposed to be. Do we have routines in our life that point us back to who and where God is? And today, as we conclude this passage in Deuteronomy chapter 6, Moses' words to the people, his final encouragement, I think Moses has some really distinct words that challenge the people to live a life worth following. He challenged the people to pass on their faith, and not just the things that they say, but in the way that they interact with every single thing that they do. When's the last time someone asked you a question about your life? And as we jump into Deuteronomy, I want you guys to keep swirling that question in the back of your mind. I want you to keep thinking, what do I want people to ask me? What do I want people to be curious about in my life? You guys have a Bible. I'd love for you to turn with me to Deuteronomy chapter 6. Deuteronomy chapter 6. We've been here for the last 3 weeks, and we're going to conclude the final 5 verses of this passage, Deuteronomy chapter 6, verses 20 through 25. It's not going to be up on the screen because I would love for us to just have this discipline of digging into it ourselves. Right? If you guys tangibly and physically say, man, like, I love this and I want to be in this too. And so if you have a Bible, open it. If you have a smartphone, Google it and open your Bible app and turn to Deuteronomy chapter 6, verses 20 through 25. If you're like me and then you start reading and following along when the person up front is speaking, then you can just listen to, because that actually helps me better, and I get that. So no shame there. If it helps you listen, but tangibly listen to these words and listen. Imagine that you are the nation of Israel. Imagine that Moses, this leader who has heard from God and is now leading the people, is speaking to you and giving you this final command before you enter the land that God promised. Moses says to the people, he says, when your children ask you in a time to come, what is the meaning of the decrees and the statutes and the ordinances that the Lord our God has commanded you? Then you shall say to your children, we were Pharaoh's slaves in Egypt, but the Lord brought us out of Egypt with a mighty hand. The Lord displayed before our eyes great and awesome signs and wonders against Egypt, against Pharaoh and all his household. He brought us out from there in order to bring us in, to give us the land that he promised, an oath to our ancestors. Then the Lord commanded us to observe all the statutes, to fear the Lord our God for our lasting good, so as to keep us alive, as is now the case. If we diligently observe this entire commandment before the Lord our God, as he commanded us, we will be in the right. Final words from Moses to the people. And I want us to kind of just verse by verse go through this. At the very beginning, you'll notice in verse 20, I think this is the key to the whole passage. Right? Remember, Moses just expressed to the people and told the people, what does it mean to live in this new land that God has given you? What does it mean to love God with everything that you have? What does it mean to build routines? And after you've done all these things, Moses says this in verse 20. He says, when your children ask you in a time to come. This isn't like if your children ask you. This is a statement. It says, when your children ask you. This is a phrase. It's a phrase with a complete ending and a complete statement here. It says, when your children ask you. And I love this phrase because it's not saying, hey, maybe you're living this life and you're in this new land, but it says, no, when your children ask you this, if they're going to ask you this. We talked about this a couple weeks ago, but children, right, family, there are these people who see you every moment of every day, and they see the way that you interact and the way that you live, and they hear the things that you talk about when no one is looking, right? And children know their parents well because they're with their parents a lot. And Moses says to the people, it's not enough to just do these things on your own, but I want you to pass these things on to the people who are most important, to your children, the people that you're tasked with caring for and loving and leading. When your children ask you, see, that culture in that time, it was an oral culture. They didn't write a lot of stuff down. The way they remembered things and the way that they taught things and the way they passed things on is they would speak it to people and they would tell people and they would tell about the stories, and that's why they would have these things like the Passover, remembering what God did to bring them out, to remember what God was doing and to have this explanation to the people, and everything they did was about communicating and about talking. And so it's not surprising that this passage says that when your kids ask you, tell them, and we'll get into that in a little bit. I think what's more surprising is that this passage starts when you're asked a question. Tell your children. It doesn't say, hey, make sure that every morning you ingrain this in your children, you talk about these things and you do these things. It says live a life that is so curious that your children, the people who know you best, can't help but ask a question of you. I don't think he's saying it's bad to ingrain these things and to talk about these things and to daily live these things with your kids. But I think the author here, that Moses is emphasizing the importance of living in such a way that people ask us questions. When your children ask you in a time to come, so again, I bring up the question, what does it look like to live a life that begs a question? What does it look like to live a life that isn't if someone asks me, but when someone asks me? To be so vibrant, to be so excited about the things of God that you just can't help but live this way, and people see it, and they see a difference, and they see the way that you love, and they see the way that you interact, and they ask you about it. It says, when your children ask you in time to come, what is the meaning of these decrees and these statutes and these ordinances that the Lord our God has commanded you? Right, so this is looking off into the future a little bit, and the people are now in and inhabiting the land that God promised them, this land flowing with milk and honey, this land of provision and sustenance and God's grace and God's mercy and God's leading in their life. It says when you're there, you've been living there, and you've established a home, you established rhythms and routines in your life, your kids are going to start wondering, why are we doing all this, and how did we get here, and where did we come from, and they're going to ask you about it. He says, be ready to tell them. Verse 21 and 22. It says, and when they've asked you these things, when they've come to you and said, Mom, Dad, why are we doing these things? And why do we follow these things? And why do we have these festivals and these routines in our life that point us back to who God is? And it says, then you shall tell them, we were Pharaoh's slaves in Egypt. The Lord brought us out of that land. And it's this moment where Moses instructs the people to then, after they've been asked a question, to tell them what has happened, to look back at the past and look back at the things that God has done, to remember those hard, grueling years of being enslaved, of working long hours and having no freedom and being confined and being constrained in this far-off land that wasn't their home. And he says, I want you to tell them about this. I want you to remember what that was like to be in this land of slavery and persecution and hardship. But not to stay there, to remind them that, but God brought us out of there. that God took us from there. When I think about this, and I think about going to this promised land, this land flowing with milk and honey, this new year 2019, that what does God have for me, and what does it look like to live into the things that God has called me to do? I think before I can get to where I'm going, I have to remember where I've been. That's good. I'm going to say it again. Before I get to where I'm going, I have to remember where I've been. I have to acknowledge those moments of slavery in my life that have been hard and have been painful, because if I ever want to get out of them, I have to acknowledge them. If I ever want to move and ever want to change and ever want to get to where God is calling me, I have to remember where I've been. And Moses says to the people, remember where you've been. You were in slavery once. And it was hard and it was painful and you didn't know where to go, and you cried out to me and you asked me for help as your God that was leading you. And I did come and I did rescue you and I did save you, and it took a long time and probably longer than you wanted me to, but I did come. And what would it look like for us, Thrive, to be a family that remembers where we've been? To call out some of the hard things. To acknowledge some of the areas maybe even now that pride creeps in, or anger creeps in, or selfishness creeps in. Because if we ever want to get to where we're going, we have to know where we are now and where we've been. And so Moses says, when they ask you this question, first thing, remember where you've been. And tell them about it. And it doesn't stop there. Verse 23. After you've recalled where you've come from and been enslaved in Egypt and seen God's mighty hand pull you out of that, it says in 23, it says, and God brought us from there in order to bring us in. That in order to go where the Israelites were going to this promised land, they had to be taken out of a place and brought to a place. He says he brought you out of there in order to bring us into where we were meant to be. To give us the land that he promised an oath to our ancestors. God, I think this is so cool, and I get so excited about it because I just think about, man, how cool is it that God is not content and okay with leaving the people in slavery and trapped here, but he says, I want to take you to a new place. I didn't just bring you here to leave you there. I brought you there to bring you hope and to bring you a future, but it takes a long time and it takes a journey, and it wasn't an instantaneous process. It took them over 40 years wandering in a desert, and finally they're waiting for this to happen, and God says, but remember, I was faithful. Remember, I followed through with the promises that I gave you. And for some of us this morning, we're thinking, man, yeah, I know where I've been, and I don't want to think about that, and maybe I can even acknowledge some of the ways now that I want to change and I want to grow, and man, I don't know fully where I'm going in it. And I think I know where I want to go, but is God going to lead me there? And is God going to be faithful to guide me and to take me and to journey with me on this path? And you're thinking, man, I don't know if he is, and I don't know if I can do this, and I'm stuck and I'm trapped. And Moses says to the people, when you get to that place, remember God's promised. That he's a God who cares and a God who knows and a God who says, yeah, I do know where I'm taking you. And it might take a long time, but I know where I'm taking you. And what does it look like for us to be a faithful people that trust God with the journey? Trust that God knows the outcome and knows where he's leading. And instead of asking why, we ask who God is. Instead of asking God, why have you done these things, we say, God, who are you, that I know that when these things happen, I can trust you and I can be led by you. And Moses instructs the people to remember who God is. He's a God who keeps his promise. And so the first thing he says when you're asked a question, to live in such a way to be asked a question, he says, tell them about your past. Tell them about your story. Tell them about where you came from. But don't end there. Tell them where you're going. Remind them where you're going and remind them that God is faithfully leading you. In verse 24, it says, then the Lord commanded us to observe all these statutes and to fear the Lord our God. Phase 3 of this plan that Moses gives to them, he says, tell them where you've been, remind them where you're going, and in the present, in this moment right here and right now, faithfully and obediently continue to do the things that God has called you to do. You want to know how to get from here to there, it means that you faithfully, obediently follow God right now. That's what the whole last part of chapter 6, that's what we spent the whole last 3 weeks talking about, is what does it look like to obediently follow God and to fear Him and to honor Him, to give Him your whole heart and your whole soul and all of your strength, and to love God so much that everything you do is consumed by God, not because we have to, but because we love God. And He says if you want to get from here to there, you have to faithfully and obediently continue to follow God in this moment. And some of us need to sit here and we need to ask the question, man, what does this look like for me to, in this moment, faithfully and obediently say, man, God, I don't know how to do this, but I just want to take one small step and commit to choosing you. Commit to saying yes to you. Commit to not just sitting here on a Sunday, but tomorrow morning when I go to work to remember you and to talk about you and to live a life that begs the question of, man, why are you living differently and why are you interacting with the world differently? What does it look like day after day and each moment of every day to commit? And Moses says, remember where you've come from. Remember where you're going, but today, faithfully and obediently live into that. And then the passage concludes with verse 25. It says, after all of these things, it says, if we diligently observe this entire commandment before the Lord our God, as He commanded us, we will be in the right. Some of your guys' translations, the way they translate that word, says we will be righteous. Now, before we get to that ending, we will be righteous, I want to focus on that very first word, because I think the whole passage hinges on this one two-letter word. He says, if. If. If is a conditional phrase. It's used to link two ideas, and it's this hinge point between these two ideas. It's this word that gives us a choice that if we do these things, this will happen. But it comes down to this one little point in the middle, this if statement. And God says to the people, Moses says to the people, he says, I want to give you this land, I want you to prosper, but you have a part in this. You have a say in this whole thing. You don't have to do this. I love you so much that I'll let you choose and do what you want to do. But if you choose me, I will be there with you. If. The people hearing this in the original language would know that it's not just this cue of if. The next verb in this word is if we diligently observe. Up at this point, all the verbs in this passage have all been in the past tense. It's all been reminding the people and telling the people of what was in the past. And we get to this moment where it comes to this hinge point of if. And in this original context here, the people would have heard this, that this word diligently observe is in this imperfect tense, which means it hasn't come to fruition yet. It hasn't come to completion yet. That is still contingent on the people's choice. That the people have a choice to choose if they're going to diligently observe, and yet the author doesn't know if they're going to do it yet. He commands him, says, if you do this, you will see the Lord's favor, and you will see the Lord leading you, and you will be called righteous. But he doesn't know what's going to happen yet. And I love that because it's reciprocal to us. It says more, we have this choice, and we have this moment that says, man, am I going to do this? Am I going to live a life that diligently and obediently serves and follows after God? And I was thinking about this passage this week, and as I was studying and as I was wrestling through it, and I was thinking about my own life, I was thinking about these if moments when I have a choice, and do I commit? And sometimes I do, and sometimes I don't. And then I was thinking about that very last phrase, and it says that if we do these things, that we will be righteous. We may be right before God. We'll be in right standing before God. And see, back in the day, I don't want to get too much into this because I don't want to bore us, but I think it's so cool That God said to the people, I want you to live rightly so that you're set apart and people see a difference, that they look at your life and they ask you a question about who you are. That the nation of Israel literally lived completely different from all the surrounding communities and people around them and nations around them, that people said, man, who are these people and who is their God? Because they're living differently. And when I first read this, I thought, man, I got to do all the right things and I got to say all the right things because I got to be righteous and I got to earn my salvation. If I do that, then God will love me and God will bless me. That's not at all what God is saying here. Right? Because we know the story of Jesus, and Jesus came to this earth and he lived and he died among us. And in the New Testament, right, this is this time thousands of years later, and this old covenant, this old promise that God had given that people have lived right and be right and God will be with you, has been shifted through the personhood of Jesus. And through Jesus, you don't have to be made right by the things that you do anymore. You're made right because you believe in Jesus. 2 Corinthians 5:20 says, for our sake, God made him who knew no sin, Jesus, to be sin, so that in him we might have the righteousness of God, that because of Jesus we are seen as righteous. Romans 10:4, for Christ is the end of the law of righteousness to everyone who believes. In the end of Deuteronomy, Moses says that the people will live right and do right, so that you will be righteous, you will have right standing with God. But that's why God sent Jesus to the earth, because he said, you're always going to fail, and you're always going to be human, you're always going to mess up. But Jesus is enough. And when you believe in him, that the righteousness of Jesus, who is fully human and yet fully God, that the righteousness that is in him is passed on to us, and we are seen as righteous. And so I read this, and I said, man, Deuteronomy chapter 6, why do I need to follow this? Why do we need to be righteous if Jesus has already done it? And I realized because the goal is not to do the right thing. The goal is to become like Jesus. The goal is to live into the image that God has called me to live into. And what does that look like? Jesus said it means two things. You love God with everything that you have. The same thing we've been talking about the last week. You love God with everything that you have, and you commit your life to saying, Jesus, I want to follow you and I want to know you. And the second thing Jesus says to do is then you love your neighbor. It doesn't say go convert your neighbor and go tell them about Jesus. It says love your neighbor. And maybe that means you share Jesus with them because Jesus is the only way that we can find true love and fulfillment. But it says love God with everything you have and love your neighbor. And that's why we've been given this righteousness. So that we can rightly follow God and be image bearers of God, who says, I want you to be a part of my family. And I want you to love me with all that you have, and I want you to love the person who's sitting next to you. And there's this same if, where we have a choice. The passage starts with a statement, when people ask you, but it ends with a condition, if you live this way. Man, so I just want to challenge us this morning, and I want to call us out a little bit, and I want to say, man, what would it look like to not just sit here on a Sunday and to take notes and to be excited and to go home and forget about it? What would it look like to actually live this way? To actually choose to say, man, I'm going to commit to this. And I don't know what it looks like, and it's hard and it's scary, but I need to change some things in my life. And I need to commit to some things in my life. And I need to be a person that is willing to say, God, you are worth it. And I want to love you with all that I have. And I want to love my neighbor because you've called me to do that. Are you doing that? It was Wednesday this past week, and I had texted one of my old friends and mentors who was a pastor up in the Bay Area when I used to work there. And I said, hey, I'd really love to video call sometime. You have some time this next week? And he said, hey, Jordan, I'll one-up you. I'm actually going to be in Fullerton. He was doing some work at Fuller Seminary down there with the Youth Institute. And he said, hey, I'm going to be in Pasadena. Do you have some time next week to hang out? So we set up this time on Wednesday evening to go hang out. And I hadn't talked to him in a long time. And hopped in my car, me and my wife Lacey, we were driving down there, and we just sat in this coffee shop, Coba Vita, because we wanted to be all hipster and cool, right? We're sitting in this nice coffee shop and way overpaid for coffee that was okay, but it was coffee, right? And And we're sitting there and we're having this conversation. He just asked me, Jordan, how are you doing, right? And I kind of just tell him this generic surface answer. I'm doing good, and things are good, and things at Thrive are great, and I've seen God do these cool things, and I'm telling him these stories. But as I'm talking, he's realizing that I'm just kind of talking on the surface. And if you ever have one of those moments when you're sitting in a conversation and you just get smacked upside the head? And that happened in this moment. And I sat there with this man that I love, and this man that I've seen day in and day out love his church. For the last 13 years, he's been a youth pastor, and he's devoted his life to pouring into these students, and he's watched them go from 6th grade on to graduating college, and he's invested everything that he has. And he doesn't have this grand resume, he doesn't have this great story, and yet he's faithfully lived every single day loving and serving Jesus. And he said, Jordan, are you actually living what you're talking about? It would have been really easy to say, yeah, I totally am. And yet I knew that, if I'm honest, no, I'm not. We've been talking about the last 3 weeks. What does it mean to have disciplines and devotions and time set up in our life that we're pursuing God with everything that we have, and not just keeping that for ourselves, but living a life in such a way that people ask me questions. And do I say, man, when's the last time someone's asked me a question? I couldn't tell you the last time someone's asked me a question about Jesus without me instigating that conversation. And that's indicative probably of the way that I'm living and the way that I'm investing and the way that I'm pouring out my life. And I have to say, man, God, am I actually living the things that I'm teaching? Because if I'm not, what am I doing standing up here? And probably that's why I'm so nervous this morning as I got up here. And he said to me in this coffee shop, he said, Jordan, commit. Actually live it out. And so as we leave here, there's going to be this if as we walk out of this room that this whole series hinges on. We can tell you to love God, and we can tell you to set up these disciplines, and we can help each other do that, and we can come to church on a Sunday, and we can start joining small groups next week, and these things are great. But it hinges on this if. And this if hasn't come to pass yet. It hasn't been fulfilled yet. It's still waiting to be unfolded, and that if depends on you saying, are you going to choose to say yes to this? Are we going to choose to diligently observe and follow God with everything that we have and love the people next to us? I was at this seminar this past weekend, and the pastor is way smarter than me and has multiple PhDs, and he was talking about the Bible, and he was talking about what does it mean to pass this on to people, and he put up some statistics, and I just want to put these up here. For all you math people in the room, you're going to love this. I love math too, and I want to just break down some numbers for us, okay? So in 2014, there was the Pew Research Center. They put out this study where they basically just interviewed so many people, and they took all this census data, and they compiled into a list. And on that list, back in, again, the study was done in 2014, 25.4% of Americans said that they would associate with evangelical Christianity, which is what we here at Thrive would say we're a part of. Okay, the population of the United States in 2017 is 325.7 million people, which means that if you took that 25.4%, that about 82.7 million Americans say that they're evangelical Christians. Now you go a little broader in the United States, and you look at the entire population of the world. Right now it's 7.53 billion, and people looking at birth rates and death rates project that in 2050, the population of the world will be about 9.7 billion, 10 billion people, we'll just say. So a little bit of math for us. I want us to imagine if each one of these 82.7 million Americans, you can go to the next slide, let's just cut that down because we all know that probably not 25.4% of Americans are actually Christians even though they go to church on Easter or Christmas, right? And so we'll cut that number in more than half. Well, when we say 40 million of those people. Okay, now we're 40 million of these people. If each one of those people committed to just loving one other person, to devoting their life to this other person, to asking them how their day was doing, to taking them out for coffee, to living a life in such a way that that person then asks them a question of why do you do what you do, and why do you live the way that you live, and what is it that you go to church on Sunday for, and why do you live this out every day? If we committed to just having one person in our life today that we loved and we invested in, that number would then double to 80 million, right? And you can see up on the screen, if you keep doing the math, and each year if that one person did that with one other person, eventually that would get to 160 million and 640 million, right? By 2024, that'd be 1.2 billion people if we chose to each person love one other person, that one other person love one other person, and so on and so forth. By the year 2027, that's over 10.2 billion people who would be changed, right? And right there, that means we're 23 years ahead of 2050, the population growth of the world. See, the numbers work out. If we each committed to loving one person, the world could be changed. And sometimes I look at this and I say, man, it's daunting and it's overwhelming. And yet I want to challenge us. What would it look like to just invest in one person? To commit for yourself to say, man, I want to love God with everything that I have. And I want to love one person well. And I want to challenge that one person, once I build this relationship, to do that with one other person. This is the Jesus pyramid scheme. Right? It's not some person sitting here on a Sunday speaking and we all sit here and we go home. No, it's every single person getting up from this room and saying, man, I want to commit to this and I want to love the world and I want to find my one person, I want to devote my life to them and I want to teach them to love someone else and I want to be a disciple who makes disciples who makes disciples, and the world changes. Will we be world changers? Imagine what it would be like if we committed to being world changers. If. I wasn't going to do this, but why not? Everyone pull your phone right now. I want you to think of one person in your life. Someone you haven't talked to in a while. Someone that for whatever reason God's put on your heart, and shoot him a text right now. Say, hey, how's it going? You don't have to say anything beyond that. And have a conversation with them and see where that goes. Right? I think sometimes we think to disciple someone and to share someone the love of Jesus, we have to have all this knowledge and all this expertise, and we have to know the Bible front and back. And no, we just have to be able to tell our story. We have to tell where we've come from. We have to know where we're going. And we have to know that today we're diligently and faithfully being obedient to God. And we tell people that story. And we walk through the person that we're telling this story to, and we say, hey, I don't know what I'm doing either. Let's do this together, and let's pursue God together, and pretty soon the world changes. But it doesn't start from up here. It starts from you guys, from us saying, we're a family of God that is tasked with loving other people. Will we be a people, a family here at Thrive that commits to loving one other person this week? For the rest of our lives. Jesus, I love you so much, and I thank you for this truth, God, and I thank you, God, that you make it so simple for us, and yet we make it muddy and murky, and we complicate it, God, and yet it's so simple, God. You just